We're reading out of Proverbs chapter 1, verses 1 through 7 here. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, for gaining wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight, for receiving instruction and prudent behavior, doing what is right and just and fair, for giving prudence to those who are simple. It's a nice way to say that, isn't it? Knowledge and discretion to the young. Let the wise listen and add to their learning. Let the discerning get guidance for understanding proverbs and parables, the sayings and riddles to the wise. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Yeah, as Steve was saying, we spent some time in Honduras, and while we were there, you know, when you're on one mission trip, you kind of can't help but recount all the other trips you've been on, mission trips you've been on, all the things you've done. And by the way, do I need to excuse the kids? Do we need to send them out? I didn't do that yet. Just the pre-Kers over here. Okay, cool. So I don't know if you know this or not. Like when I was young, I was a youth pastor. That was part of my gig, and I did everything pretty much perfectly. Just like I was really good at being a youth pastor. There was almost nothing I did wrong. In fact, I worked at a small church in Virginia Beach for a little bit, and I remember Brandon was asking me about kind of like my first mission trips, and I said, I remember one that I was leading, and this was one of the first ones I ever led. It was to Hope Hill, Kentucky, which is, if you don't know where that is, neither does anybody else. Hope Hill, Kentucky is a little tiny place. They had a little home for girls that had come out of trafficking, different things like that. So they sent us to go work there and do some things to help out and just around the facility. I remember the first day we got there, I was the only staff member who went to this, and I was there with one of our elders. And our elder from the board of elders of our church was the only other person that was like really in charge of anything there. And there was a bunch of like youth. And so we got there, and we had taken this elder's van to go there. We get in his van, we all load up, we get there. I remember specifically there were just a few youth. Two of them were his sons, were the elder's sons. And then there were a smattering of a few others. One of them was in a neck brace because she had been in a very severe car accident. And it was one of those things where if she like bumped anything, she could have, spinal damage for the rest of her life. And so it was like really serious. I don't know why she came on a mission trip. It probably wasn't the right place for her. But I was like, well, let's just take care of her. We'll kind of bubble wrap her, put her to the side. First day we get there, we are cutting through weeds and weed whacking, and we find a hive, a massive hive. I'm talking across an entire fence type of hive of hornets. And the hornets come out and they stung our elder's son so badly he had something like, I'm talking hundreds of welts all over him. He was laid up for days because he had so much poison in his body from the hornets. It was really great. It was like the My Girl scene. And so we had that whole situation happen. Then the next day, we're out cutting down trees. As we're cutting down trees, I hear a scream and a chainsaw going and a scream that comes out of this forest. And our elder who was cutting down the tree had accidentally also cut his son's wrist with that chainsaw. Fortunately, he was wearing a watch, but it cut that watch, and the metal actually stopped it a little bit, but it still went very deep, cutting into his wrist. We had to take him to the emergency room. So now those two boys are out. Our elder is basically out of the picture, and so it's up to me to kind of keep this trip running. And so I have some things where I'm like, okay, so pull the girl with a neck brace out because we got work to do. We got to get everybody out of retirement here. Everybody's on call, so we start working together. We're doing stuff. And as we're working, we're painting something. And they're like, Kevin, we need to go into town for paint. Take some of the kids with you. Just go into town, get some drinks, get some paint. Like, just hang out for a little bit. Like, take it easy, but go ahead and do that. So I take this elder's van, and I start driving into town. And as I'm driving, there's these really sharp turns because you're kind of in these winding back roads of Kentucky. And I start driving and I see these sharp turns, but I'm not really in a place where I want to slow down, right? Like I want to keep going the same speed I'm going. And I'm not really thinking about it too hard until I come up to one turn specifically. And as I go around the turn, a huge semi comes the other way. And it starts to take up more than just its section of the road. It takes up a little bit of my section of the road too, because it has to make a very wide turn. And I don't really know what to do. I probably should have exchanged mirrors with them, to be honest with you, or just let that go. But instead, I veer off to the side of the road. And the van now starts to go down into a ditch. There's a ravine that runs alongside the road. And the van goes down into that ditch. We're now down in the ditch, but there turns out there's a cattle crossing, a cattle guard right up here. So we're down in the ditch, but then the van goes up to hit the cattle guard. We are now airborne. I kid you not, airborne, like Vin Diesel airborne. We are in the air Fast and Furious style, until we go to the other side of the cattle guard, and that van lands on all four tires pop instantly. The truck's now gone. It's probably gotten wherever it was going to go. They probably have a great life right now. And I'm sitting there, and I look back at the kids with me, specifically the one in the neck brace. Oh boy, this went well. Everybody okay? She goes, we're going to take that as a win. We're going to call that good. You can move your arm. We're going to say that's good enough at this point. I don't know what to do. It's not my van. As soon as we hit the ground, though, I look over, there's a farmer who was on his tractor, and he just stops. He's not shocked at all. He just gets off his tractor, and he just walks into his garage. He comes out with a really big truck that already has a tow cable attached to it. And he just pulls us out of it. I think this guy does this every day. I think that he's seen this happen so many times. He pulls us out of there. We get the van to the other side of the road. It's now sitting there with 4 pop tires. And I have to call this elder and tell him, hey, I wrecked your van pretty good. I also may have wrecked people in the van. I'm not sure what's going to happen. I call him. He says, actually, can we just leave the van there? And I was like, well, I don't know. I need a place to get back. He was like, I'll just find another car. We actually ended up selling that van to that farmer, and we just rented a van and got out of there. We were done with the mission trip. That's how it ended. It was pretty great. Now, I remember years later, I was applying for another job in youth ministry at a very large church, and I was getting this call about going to do this. And I remember the pastor there had called all my references, including this church that I had done this at, right? And I remember he called all my references, and he called me, and he said, hey, Kevin, I've gone through all your references. And he said, there's some, I think his word were there's some colorful stories about you. I'm like, well, that's a nice way to say that. And he said, do you have anything you want to tell me? Anything you want to say? And I was like, oh boy, that's a loaded question. And I just stopped and I said, you know what? There's probably a lot of things that I've done wrong. Probably a lot of things that I've not done well. And I said, be honest with you, I've been young and dumb for a long time. And I remember him stopping, and he said, that's a really interesting point. He said, it's interesting that you recognize that you were young and dumb. Some people never recognize that. And I said, well, I've learned a lot since then. I remember this specific line. I said, I've learned a lot since then. And he said, well, you've learned a lot, but have you actually done anything with what you've learned? Have you done anything with what you've learned? Now, I don't know if you ever think about this or how this works, but I think there's a big difference between what we learn and what we do with what we learn. We're going to be going through, for the next few weeks, or really through the summer, through some different Proverbs, going through the book of Proverbs. We're not going to go line by line through the whole thing, but we're going to start going through this book and looking at wisdom. And the whole idea of wisdom is that it's not just what you learn, it's not just information, it's transformation. It's not just what you learn in information or the way that we learn information. It's doing something with that information. Solomon writes this book, and he writes this thing in a way for us to understand it, even years later, that there's going to be a lot for us to learn from this book. And he wants us to understand that there is a reason that wisdom matters. In our culture, I actually don't know that I would say wisdom matters anymore. I think wisdom's kind of lost its way. It's like a cool thing that's an add-on, but we have so much information, we think that we don't need the transformation that wisdom brings. If you're not familiar with Proverbs, let me just give you a quick overview, a few things you might want to know as we go through this. First of all, there's kind of a preamble. So chapters 1 through 9 of Proverbs really set us up for this preamble of why. Why does wisdom matter? Which is shocking, because you might think, why do we need that? Shouldn't we just know that wisdom matters? But Solomon doesn't seem to think so. He thinks he has to give us a case for why wisdom is actually important. Here's why you need wisdom. And for about 9 chapters, he's going to give us, there's 10 different spots where he talks to his quote-unquote son, where he lays it out like he's talking to his child, and we'll get into maybe why he does that. But it's almost like he lays it out like, here's 10 sayings from a father to a son. Then there's in that preamble, there's also 4 different poems that will happen as you go through it. But then he does, in the next chapters, you're going to see 10 through 29. That's where we see kind of the part that you're probably used to. All these little pithy, tiny, pointed statements, right? These little one-off liners that are just here's a one-off thing that you should know. Here's some practical, here's some metaphorical stuff. Here's some causal stuff. Maybe some stuff that you should know about, just really quick one-liners. And you might know these, the practical, for instance. You may have heard some of these before. A practical one is in Psalm 20 or Proverbs 25. Proverbs 25, right? Here's a very practical saying. If you find honey, eat just enough. Too much of it and you will vomit. This is just practical advice, right? Like, don't eat too much honey. You'll yak everywhere and nobody will like that. It's pretty simple teaching, right? Like, he's just giving you practical advice. Don't eat too much honey, right? Don't have too much of that. He also gives you kind of that metaphorical advice. Psalm 20, or Proverbs 26, Proverbs 26. Here's like a metaphor, right? As a dog returns to its vomit, which is, apparently that dog had too much honey. As a dog returns to its vomit, so fools repeat their folly. Like, so we are going to do the same thing. We know it's bad for us. We know it's not a good idea, but we go back to it over and over again, right? He's giving us a metaphor. This is what it looks like. That causal type of thing. He's going to give us like causal pieces. So here's a cause and effect. Like, he's going to say, lazy hands make for poverty, diligent hands bring wealth. So it's a cause and effect. This is what will cause this. This is what will cause that. Now, as you may know, if you've been around here before, I have some hard times with the causal parts of Proverbs. And actually, if you know anything about Proverbs, and I just want to say this as a disclaimer before we get into this too far, Proverbs is one of the most highly debated books to have been put in the Bible. I know that sounds weird because we all see Proverbs and we're like, it seems like a good book. Yeah, it's fine. But actually, it was highly debated if this should be included in the Bible because that cause and effect is really hard to work with. Sometimes it's true. But how many of you know people who, like, again, like what we just read, how many people do you know that have worked their hands to the bone and they're still just barely scraping by? Do you know people like that? I do, right? So like the cause and effect doesn't always work out the way we think it will. Solomon's setting it up, saying this is how you can understand it. And yes, there's truth to it, and there's ways that we can understand it. I just want to give a disclaimer before we get too far into this book. There will be things that I personally will kind of bristle against. I'll just be honest with you. There's some things that rub me the wrong way a little bit here. But he's trying to set up just a general form of wisdom that makes sense. Again, he talks about train up your child in the way they should go, and they'll never depart from it. How many of you know people who have raised their kids in every way the right way? And their kid, like, is a complete train wreck. Anybody know this? Anybody have that? Yeah. Well, you don't have to talk about your own kids this way. Okay, now we're getting real serious. I see all the elbows flying. You don't have to be like that. I'm just saying, like, but you know this, right? Like, this is train up the child. And there's people I know that have devoted their lives to training up their child in what I would consider a very good way to go, and they depart from it. They do walk away from it. So I'm just saying that cause and effect can be a little bit tricky, and we'll get into that as we go through the series. But he does that through chapters 10 through 29. He's going to give us all these really quick one-liners, and we're going to get into some of those as we go. And the last two chapters are actually poems. So it's actually kind of a how wisdom is really used. Like, this is what it looks like. And there's actually two poems where he takes apart some understandings of, like, this is what we see and how they are play out with two different specific characters and how this goes. But that first 1 through 9 is where I want to spend some time today. I just want to talk about why this matters. Again, Solomon's going to give us 9 chapters on why this matters. 9 chapters about why this is so important to us. And for some of us, that might sound very simple, but wisdom, I don't think, is out of style. In many ways, I think wisdom might be more necessary than ever. For a while, we've thrown wisdom by the wayside because we have so much knowledge. So we're like, well, I don't need wisdom because I can get all the information I need. I have so much information coming at me that wisdom is kind of dumb. And so for me, like, that's why I live the way I want to live, and I do the things I want to do, whether it's hedonism or it's some version of living an Epicurean lifestyle where it's just like, c'est la vie, like, live today for today and don't think about tomorrow because tomorrow we die, right? Eat, drink, be merry. Tomorrow we die. That's kind of the version of life we have. The YOLO version of life, right? If you were alive in the early aughts, you remember the YOLO version of life, right? Whereas you only live once, and so you do what you want, and you live that way. And we all have that mentality still to some extent. Because we have so much knowledge, we don't think the wisdom matters. But I would say that there's a reason that Solomon gives us 9 chapters worth of understanding this. I actually think for him, it's somewhat like maybe me or you. I think some of it is some stuff that he wished he knew when he was younger. I think there was a time he was young and dumb. If you look at the origin story of Solomon, and we'll just look at it really quickly, but if you go back into Chronicles, you'll see that there's a moment where David is praying over the temple. This is the first real intro of Solomon, by the way. And David is praying over the temple. He's about to anoint and to invite the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of God, into this temple. And he's giving his final prayer. This is actually the last words we see David speak in the book of Chronicles. This is the last words he says, is in this prayer. And he starts the prayer with this. Then King David said to the whole assembly, this is what he says to him. He starts off the whole prayer with, my son Solomon, the one God has chosen, is young and inexperienced. Like he starts off his whole prayer with, so Solomon's young, probably not the brightest kid I got, probably not the best for this. He's not ready for any of this, to take over Israel, to build this temple to God. He's not really ready for any of it. He says the task is great because this palatial structure, this temple, is not for man but for the Lord. Like this is a huge task ahead of him. And he goes on, later on in the prayer, he comes back to it. Chapter 29 still, but in verse 19 he says, and give my son Solomon the wholehearted devotion to keep your commandments, statutes, and decrees, and to do everything to build the palatial structure for which I have provided. Like, remind him of these things. This is his prayer for Solomon. There's a part of you can sense, I don't know about you, if you read this prayer, I sense that there's a little bit of David that's like, oh boy. You know, like he's handing the family business over, an entire nation, an entire economic understanding, an entire governmental understanding. He's handing all these things over to Solomon, and there's a little bit of him that's like, ooh, we'll see how this goes. I'm not sure he's ready for this. And in many cases, if you read about Solomon, I would say David's right. Solomon, I think, for a little bit struggles. Now we see in 1 Kings, he goes and he asks for wisdom. He asks God for wisdom, and that's great. But I think there's a part of him that's almost like, I wish you understood what I understood. I wish I would have understood then what I understand now. Like I wish I would have gotten it then the way I understand it now. As the famous theologian Katy Perry once said, if I knew then what I know now, right? She says, wouldn't give in, wouldn't bow down. That's what she says, right? She realized if I would have known then what I know now, right? And I think many of us live this way. I mean, I was in a meeting this week with a person who works on my team in the organization I work for, and we were having this meeting, and she had just won a lawsuit. She'd won a settlement. She was in a really, really nasty car accident, and she had hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical bills. And I mean, it was pretty tragic, like a pretty serious situation. And she had to take the people to court to try to get her fees for her medical bills, and she got those. Finally, it took over almost 2 years to get through all the litigation of it. And she got the settlement, and I said, so you got all the money you needed? She said, yeah. And then we actually ended up finding we have like $29,000 over what our medical bills were. And I said, oh, what are you going to do with that? And she was like, well, and she's very young. And she goes, my fiance and I are thinking we're going to head to Italy for a few weeks. Now, some of you are like, good for her. Some of you in this room are immediately like, oh, no, don't do that. Don't do that. Spend the money, use the money on something else. Buy a house, buy land. I don't know, buy a cow. That's probably worth more than what you're going to get out of Italy. Like, do something with that money, right? Anybody feel that way? Like, right off the bat. I remember, I almost wanted to jump in and just be like, no, don't do that. Don't go. I mean, it's great. Italy's great. I love it. I love Italy. But let me just tell you, do you have any other debts you can pay off? Any student loans? Anything else you can do with that money? Now, but I looked at myself and I thought, when I was her age, I would have done the same thing, right? Anybody feel like you have those things where you're like, if I would have known then what I know now, if I would have understood it. I think Solomon's trying to let us in on this, and that's why he uses this father-son language so often. He's like, my son, if I could just tell you what I know now, if I could have that wisdom that I have now at your age. How many of you have ever thought about this? If I could go back in time, if I could speak to a younger me, if I could do things differently when I was younger, how would I have done them differently? What would that have looked like? And how would my life have been different if I would have had the wisdom that I have now when I had it then? That's what Solomon's trying to get us to understand. And so he comes up with these beautiful lines, and I just want to read you a bit of it. I just want to go through some of this kind of selected text in this preamble, because he comes up with this beautiful analogy for what wisdom is and how it works. I'm going to read it again, that first bit, and go through some of these pieces of Proverbs. He says, the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, for gaining wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight and receiving instruction in prudent behavior, doing what is right and just and fair. And let me just stop there for a quick second. We'll come back to this probably later in the series. But right and just and fair, if we were to describe what wisdom is, those three behaviors would probably solve almost all of our issues. If in every situation we literally just ask ourselves, in this situation, what is right? What is just? What is fair? Probably have a lot of our issues solved right there. He goes from there. For giving prudence to those who are simple, which this word simple in the Hebrew doesn't just mean like, it does kind of mean those who are not super intelligent. It actually has a little bit of meaning of those who are evil, like those who are almost, and the word I would use here is those who are intentionally ignorant. Do you know people like this? They could know more, they could do more, but they try to keep themselves from knowing that, because if they know it, then they're going to have to do it. Have you ever had do you know people like this? I watched some children just the other day who figured this out. That like if they, maybe you have a kid like this, that you're like cleaning things up, you're doing the cleaning work, and they figure out if they just stay in their room and never come out, then they don't see that you're cleaning. Then they don't have to get involved in the cleaning. You know what I'm saying? Some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. And some of you are this person still. You're still like, yeah, I do that all the time. Like, I just remembered I got to run an errand, and I don't have to do this thing, right? It's those who are intentionally ignorant. That's what he's talking about. You have chosen to be ignorant to this on purpose. And I think there are some of us that are that. But he says those who are simple, right? Those knowledge and discretion to the young. And let the wise listen and add to their learning. So those who are wise, you can get wiser. For understanding proverbs and parables, which he's going to use in a little bit, and the sayings and riddles of the wise. He's saying, I'm about to lay out a bunch of weird riddles and parables and proverbs, and you're going to have to try to decipher those. I hope that you have the wisdom for that. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise, they actually hate wisdom and instruction. And how many of us, if we're being honest, and maybe this is one of the things we need to address right as we begin this book together, how many of us bristle at the idea of instruction? Just like on a daily basis. How many of us almost right away, somebody comes to you, they tell you something you need to do or something, and immediately your gut reaction is like, nope, not me. Like your gut reaction is, I don't take instruction from anybody. I'm my own person. Now, my wife, she loves rules. Like she loves a good rule. There has never been a party in my house that does not involve rules, because rules make it more fun. And maybe you're wired that way. But for most of us, I think we bristle at the idea of instruction. He says, yeah, we need to receive instruction here, because fools are the ones who despise instruction. Chapter 2, let me just give you some pieces from this. My son, if you accept my words, there's that my son language, and store my commands within you, turning your ear to wisdom and applying to your heart to understanding. Indeed, if you call out for insight and cry aloud for understanding, and if you look for it as for silver and you search for it as for hidden treasure, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom from his mouth. His mouth comes knowledge and understanding. He holds success in store for the upright. He is a shield for those who walk that are blameless. For he guards the course of the just and protects the way of his faithful ones. Then you will understand what is right and just and fair. Every good path. There it is again, right and just and fair. For wisdom will enter your heart, and knowledge will be pleasant to your soul. Discretion will protect you, and understanding will guard you. Chapter 4, he says, listen, my sons, to a father's instruction. Pay attention and gain understanding. I give you sound learning, so do not forsake my teaching. For I too was a son to my father, still tender and cherished by my mother. Which, I don't know if that changed or what happened there. It's like that, you used to be so cute, type of thing. Then he taught me, and he said to me, take hold of my words with all your heart. Keep my commands, and you will live. Get wisdom and understanding. Do not forget my words or turn away from them. Do not forsake them, and she will protect you. Love her, and she will watch over you. The beginning of wisdom is this: get wisdom. That's how you get wisdom, is by getting wisdom. This is where wisdom begins, is you get it. Cherish her, and she will exalt you. Embrace her, and she will honor you. She will give you a garland to grace your head and present you with a glorious crown. Why does this matter? Why is he writing all this? He's trying to tell us this is why this will matter to your life. This is why this will be so important to you. As we go through this series, like, we might not fully understand why this matters so much. Like, why is this such a big deal for us? I think we really struggle with the idea of this. Now, here's part of the problem we have, is that we think that sometimes knowledge is the beginning and end of everything. Let me just say this. Wisdom solves what knowledge cannot. Wisdom solves what knowledge cannot. We live in the information age. We still live in the information age. And I want to just walk you through a few different points here. And I'm sorry, this might be really boring. I apologize. But I think we have to understand there is a difference between wisdom and knowledge. We can be very knowledgeable. We can get information like crazy, but that does not mean that we'll be people of wisdom. It does not mean that. You can know all the right things and do all the wrong things. The two are not compatible with each other. They do not mean they are synonymous with one another. The fact that you can know things but never do them is a real problem we have in our culture. We have more information now than we've ever had in the entire history of the world. Like, we really do. We have more information at this moment. Buckminster Fuller wrote a book in the 80s that was a brilliant book on understanding he called it the critical path. But it was understanding how much information has been created in the world. This is terrifying, by the way. So in his understanding, this graph is very, very boring. It's not super exciting. Let me try to explain it in a different way. He's writing about how much information is created and how often information will double. So like, how long does it take for the amount of information we have in the world to double itself? For the first 1,500 years since Jesus, so from Jesus to where the first 1,500 years after Jesus, it took 1,500 years for that to double, right? So that's a pretty long time. Then after it doubled once, after 1,500 years, the next time it doubled was after 250 years. So it starts to compound on itself. Does that make sense? Now we're compounding on itself. The next 100 years leads us to World War II, but 100 years later, it compounds on itself. It doubles itself again. Up until the 90s, when information doubled, I'm talking the amount of information in the world doubled every 12 months. Once a year, we had twice the information we had the year before. Today, it doubles every 12 hours. The amount of information in the world doubles every 12 hours. In fact, Buckminster was correct. Buckminster, by the way, fascinating guy. If you ever read up on him, he's the guy who invented the geodesic dome. So if you ever go to Epcot, he's the guy that invented that style of living. And they thought at one time it was going to solve all of homelessness in the world because it was way cheaper to make a big place. You could put a lot of people in it. But he wrote this idea in the 80s saying that we were going to double our information. We're more than doubling it. He was absolutely right. In fact, today, 328.77 million terabytes of data are created every single day. The next one, I don't even know what it means. 180 zettabytes of data is expected to be generated by 2025. I don't even know what that is. If you do, let me know. I don't know what a zettabyte is. That's a lot of information. But we are constantly looking for information. We are constantly having information. Google processes almost 99,000 searches every second. There's so much information. We're looking for information all the time. And that means that every day, 8.5 billion searches happen on Google. Every single day. That's a ton of information that's out there. And we're looking for it constantly, and we're adding to it. And now we have generative AI that's actually helping us create more information from ourselves. We're just generating more and more information. Buckminster Fuller was absolutely right about that. And the problem is that we're not adapted to continue to build on that information. In fact, Thomas Friedman wrote a book a few years after that was really brilliant about how we learn. And it was called Thank You for Being Late, which Thank You for Being Late should be the title of my biography someday. But this book was all about how we are adapting as humankind and how technology and information is actually overwhelming us. We cannot possibly actually take in the amount of data we're getting every day. It's impossible for us. I don't know if you feel this way. Have you ever opened up your phone and just been like, I can't deal with this right now? There's just too much coming at me. Too much information is out there right now. We don't know how to our bodies, physically and as humans, we can't even keep up with it. In fact, there's new types of anxiety called information anxiety. We actually have anxiety because we have so much information coming at us that it builds anxiety in us. Because we're almost like, how do I get to all this information? What do I do with all of it? There's too much here. Anybody feel this way? Yes. On a daily basis where it's too much? In fact, again, like it's created new types of anxiety, by the way. Like information anxiety created entertainment anxiety. Entertainment anxiety is a new one where we actually have stress. We actually are anxious about the entertainment we can't keep up with. So when you talk to a friend and they're like, have you watched that new show on Netflix or whatever? And you're like, no, I haven't. But then you're like, I have so many things I was trying to get through. I have this show, then I was going to watch that movie, and then I have to make another new subscription to Peacock for some reason, and I got to have, there's so many things, right, that you're like a nervous wreck, and everything that comes up, it creates more anxiety. This is entertainment, and it creates anxiety in us because there's so much coming at us all the time. We're not prepared to deal with that. Like, there comes a limit to how much information we can actually process. Believe it or not, your brain cannot process all of the information out there. It's just not possible. And I'm not trying to say like you're simple. I'm just saying we're not built for that. There's too much information. That's the goal of what was being written. And then the sad part is that information turns into just entertainment because we don't know what to do with it. So what we do is we just do nothing. We do nothing with it. I've shared before like how my understanding of this has changed considerably when I go to my grandparents. I'm heading out there in July to go see my grandparents that live in the middle of nowhere, Oklahoma. It's literally called No Man's Land. And you know what's really cool is someday I get to inherit a place called No Man's Land. And I can't wait because I don't want to be there either. Nobody wants to be there. It's the middle of nothing. I'm heading out there to go visit my grandmother's turning 100 years old. In July. Yeah, she's still kicking. She lives on her own. She drives to the store every day at 2 p.m. when the roads are, that's the least busy part of the day, she tells me. And she drives to the store at 2 p.m. Yeah, she's still kicking. The women in that side of my family are immortal, and they live forever. And so Rosella's still out there. She's still doing her thing, but I'm going out there to visit her. And I remember seeing when I went out there when I was a kid, they still had the phones, like the old phones, but they had party lines, right? Where you would call just a party line, and all of those phones were connected to each other. So you would just get one call, and it would go to all the houses in that circuit. And you would get a call, and they would say, and I remember one time specifically, there was a Johnson family down the road. The Johnson's family's barn burned down. And we got a call on the party line. Everybody found out the Johnson's barn is burning down. Now, they weren't calling us to tell us that so that we could be like, that's so sad. Let me go change my profile picture on Facebook to be like, hashtag save the Johnson's barn. They weren't telling us that information so that we could like just share it with other people and be like, hey, did you hear about the Johnson family? Did you hear about that? They weren't telling us so that we could just have a political activism party in our little local town to talk about the Johnsons. They were telling us that because they needed people to come down and actually put out the fire. And then they needed people who were going to like take care of the Johnson family afterwards, like bring them meals the next day, take care of their kids while they had to go rebuild things or deal with insurance. That's why they told us, because information was actionable. There was action required of information. That's no longer the case, by the way. Most of the information we get today is not actionable. It's so that you can go and put a hashtag out, feel good about yourself. It's so you can go rally some people together and complain about it or argue about it or have a debate about it. But that's entertainment. That's not information. I'm sorry. True information, true information, like that comes at you for real, is supposed to be something you can act on. And actually, I would challenge you, and I challenge myself on this too, is how much of the information am I spending time on that has nothing to do with my own life? Like, how much of the information coming at me am I actually using? And so there's the third scholar that kind of brings this all together is Neil Postman when he writes about this in Amusing Ourselves to Death, which if you've never read, you should. It's phenomenal, prophetic type of book. It's kind of scary. Although I will say at the end, his book was all about television and how television would end us with just entertainment instead of information, which I think is true, that we have a hard time telling the difference between information and entertainment on television. Just watch, I don't know, cable news. And I think he was right about it. Now, at the end, he does say, there's the internet coming. I don't think it's going to be a big deal. Oh, he missed the boat on that one. But anyways, he was absolutely right. Read the book. It's phenomenal. But he says this, most of our daily news is inert. It's consisting of information that gives us something to talk about, but cannot lead to any meaningful action. And that's where we get left. Like, that's what happens. Let me just give you a quick recap of the three things we just talked about. First of all, we have more information than ever before. We're overwhelmed and paralyzed by the amount of information. And we use the information to keep ourselves from transformation. We use it as entertainment instead of some transformative pieces of information. But that's like literally the opposite of everything we're supposed to do. That's not how wisdom works. Wisdom cannot be devoid of action with the information. Wisdom cannot just be information. It has to be transformation. Wisdom is applied knowledge. When knowledge comes to us, we apply that knowledge to do the next thing. It can't just be information. It has to be transformation. It does not work without the other. In fact, there was a scholar, Barry Schwartz, who has done TED Talks. He's actually written TED books for like the TED, if you know TED Talks, that kind of thing. He's done some TED Talks. He's a phenomenal psychologist. I love this. He talks about TED, the organization. He says this: at TED, which is brilliant people, brilliance is rampant. It's scary. Like, these are very smart people. The good news is that you don't need to be brilliant to be wise. The bad news is that without wisdom, brilliance isn't enough. It's as likely to get you and others into trouble as anything else. Like, you can separate brilliance and wisdom. Why? Because brilliance is just a lot of information. Wisdom requires transformation. Charles Spurgeon says it in a different way, but he says this: wisdom is the right use of knowledge. It's the right use of. To know is not to be wise. Just knowing is not wisdom. Many men know a great deal and are all the greater fools for it. There is no fool so great as a knowing fool. And I mean, think about it for a quick second, but like, have you ever driven by a hospital and you've seen a bunch of nurses outside smoking? And you're like, well, that seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? Now you got to get through the day, you know? Have you ever had this? I know financial planners who have gone broke. Like, they've lost everything. I mean, even Delilah on the radio, who helps people with their marriages, she's been divorced 3 times. She's on her 4th marriage. And it seems like just the right Elton John song would have fixed that. You know? Just a well-timed Your song and we would have all been fine. I mean, right? So, I mean, even the experts, and if we're getting real about it, if we're being honest about it, like, how many pastors do you know? Maybe I shouldn't bring myself into this, but how many pastors do you know who know the Bible pretty good? And yet, how many do we see that fall with infidelity? How many do we see that fall with pride, with the way they run things? I mean, how many do we see that fall? Is it because they don't know the information? And let's broaden it out. Let's not just talk pastors. Let's talk, I don't know, Christians. Let's not just make it about me. Let's all be part of this conversation. Where we know the information, right? I would guess you could quote me a couple Bible verses. I would guess you would know some ethics on some things that are in the Bible. And for each one of us, the question isn't, do we know the information? Like, that's not when we stand before Jesus someday and we have a conversation with him. I don't think his question is going to be like, so, you know, you want to quote some verses back and forth? Let's do some sword drills. Do you remember sword drills? Anybody ever do that where you had to sit down in the room and they'd call out a scripture and you'd have to go find the scripture as fast as you could? Yeah. I don't think Jesus is like, let's do sword drills. It's going to be cool. No, he wants to talk about the transformation that's happened within us. That's what wisdom is. That's why wisdom matters. I mean, I think even Jesus wants this for us, right? Like, if you flip, if you have your Bible, you're welcome to. If not, it's totally fine. Just in Matthew 7, right? This is what Jesus says. You guys know this passage, I promise. But he says, therefore, everyone, this is, by the way, this is at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. He's just told us everything about what we're supposed to do. All the information has been laid out. But now he wants to let us know the information means nothing if you don't do this. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine, all the information, and what? Puts them into practice. You don't get a gold star just because you sat there and you listened. Even if you took notes, that's great. Not going to matter. What matters is if you put them into practice. That's how you become a wise man. That's wisdom. Because you built your house on a rock. And he says, then the rains came, right? And the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against the house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. Next verse, but everyone who hears these words of mine and what? Does not put them into practice. Does not. Is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. I actually love the word foolish there, by the way. If you read it in the Greek, it's the word moros. Moros. If you don't know where the word moros gets translated in English, it's the word moron. Jesus, I'm not exaggerating when I say Jesus is calling them morons. If you want to be a moron, then hear what I said. And what's the only difference? Both of them can check the box on hearing the information. Right? Both the wise and the foolish man can check the box. We both heard the same information. The only thing that changes from wisdom to foolishness, the only thing that takes us from being moros to being wise people, the only thing that changes those things is putting it into practice. And he says, it's like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain came down, and the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. Now, here's what I love about this passage. If you don't know what Jesus is talking about in this, first of all, he's talking about a house which is much more than what we think of. It's not an investment property. It's not even just a place you live. Most of these houses that he's talking about, they would have been in families for generation upon generation. It's the most important thing you have. It is the only thing that's going to matter. You're not just going to find another one if this one crashes. You're not just going to go out and rent a new place. It's very hard to get a hold of a house in this society. He's saying this is the most important thing you have. You've built your entire life, your entire legacy on this place. This is what you're building it on. And where are you going to put all those things? And he actually says, like, one of them builds on the rock and one builds on the sand. If you've ever been to the Middle East, what you know is rock is not just on the top surface. You've got to do some digging. Somebody's actually got to dig. And the wise man actually decides to dig and actually get down to the bottom of that and do something with this. They actually have to do something about this. They actually have to move on this. And we don't know why the foolish man doesn't. We don't know why he doesn't dig down and do some work on this. That's what I love, is Jesus doesn't tell us, but maybe he was really busy that day. Maybe he had like a lot going on in his life. Maybe he was really distracted. Maybe he was really frustrated with some other things. Maybe he had a lot going on. Like, maybe that's what happens. And that's why we mostly miss out on wisdom, is because we don't pursue it and actually consider it something we need to attain. We just think it's just going to fall in our laps. But one of them actually takes the time to pursue and dig down and get there. And on the outside, I guarantee you both of these houses look very similar. I guarantee you that from the outside, you would never know. Like, anybody follow Zillow Gone Wild? You know Zillow Gone Wild? It's an Instagram account. It's now a TV show on HGTV of where like somebody just takes pictures off of Zillow and they show you a picture of the house and then they show you what's going on inside of it, and it's wild. It's crazy. Like, there's one that they showed recently that was like this really beautiful house. It looks really nice on the outside. You go to the inside of it, it gets real weird really fast. And then you start to see like there's a lot of things happening in these houses. Sometimes it's just like they have lots of tiger stripes, or they have like, I don't know, an indoor boat that's just sitting inside their house, whatever it would be. And you're like, this is real weird. That's what's happening. Like, from the outside it looks great. Go to the inside and you're like, uh-oh, this one's not going to stand. And then there's this flood that comes. And when the flood comes, when the flood happens, and here's what happens. Here's what I love about what Jesus says. He doesn't say if a flood happens. He doesn't say like if something bad happens to that house. Because if you've ever been to the Middle East, you know there's these wadis and there's these ravines, and flash floods are actually very common. And he's not saying like if it happens. He's saying this will happen to you. There's going to come a day where the rains are going to fall and you're going to have a flash flood and something's going to shake you to your core. And when this shakes, when this whole thing happens, where will you be? That's when wisdom will show itself. When these rains come, it's going to show us what's really underneath, what we've built our life on. If we built our lives on pride and greed and lust and whatever, it's going to reveal itself. That's where it's going to show up. If we've built our lives on the wisdom that Jesus has taught, on the wisdom that we see comes from fear of the Lord, a wisdom of what is right and true and just. If we build our lives on that, then when the rains come, and they will come, our lives will be standing upon that. We have to learn to apply this knowledge. Wisdom solves what just knowledge cannot. And my prayer for us as we begin this, and we're going to go through this for the summer, we're going to spend some time in this. We're just going to look at what wisdom is and how it works and get real practical about that. But my hope is that we are very honest with ourselves about that. And what my hope is, and this is my hope, not just for this series, but across the board, but still for this series, is that we don't come in here just looking for knowledge. That we don't walk out of here just going, well, that was good. That was real good. I took a lot of notes today, and I got more information about that. I now know the background of that. I can speak 2 more Hebrew words. But that we walk out of here and we don't just have information, we have transformation. That we walk out of here with wisdom, not just with knowledge. Not just for information, but with transformation. So as we begin that together, what I'd like to do is we're going to just spend some time together and just kind of prepare our hearts for that as a church. And we're going to sing for a second and just spend a minute in that. But if you would, let's stand together as we close.